Step 3, perfection, fulfillment, maturity, the goal or the end to which this is all heading. And look at what step 3 looks like for Israel. Well, Israel doesn't reach step 3 in the Old Testament. However, Israel is given promises of a new heaven, a new earth, and its new place there. Even in the midst of all of Israel's trials, as things are awful, really awful, God sends promises through the prophets that God will save Israel and have mercy on Israel, and that all nations will be finally remade through this renewing of Israel. So step 3 in Israel's history is in the form of a promise. Look at how Paul frames the present in terms of the future, not just of you and me, but of all creation. This is Romans 8:18. I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory. Glory is a key word this week. That is to be revealed to us. Because the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and obtain the glorious liberty of the children of God. We ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, that first fruits language is anticipating step 3. This is just the beginning of the fullness to come. We groan inwardly as we wait for adoption as heirs. What's the connection between the redemption of all nature and the perfection of all nature and the perfection of the heirs of the promise? My best guess is that there's a kind of bottleneck. The universe is ready for renewal. The universe doesn't have its own mechanism for renewal. It's either freeze or fry, as they say. Either it all just dissipates into a big soup of entropy, or it collapses back on itself. And it depends on renewal from beyond, from its creator. But it's got to wait for us, because the promises rest on Abraham's offspring. So it's almost as if the universe is in line behind Israel. And when Israel is delivered, then the bottleneck is removed and the rest of creation can get what it needs. That might be how Paul's imagining it here. At any rate, step 3 is a restoration of all things that hinges somehow on the restoration of God's people in answer to his prophets. And that comes down to you and me groaning and hoping and living in the situation that Paul sketches out here in Romans 8. What does step 3 look like? Well, it looks like finishing. The word perfection comes with more than one meaning in English, and so it can be a little misleading. Like, I'm going to be perfect? What does that mean? Does that mean I'll have superpowers? That doesn't need to be what the word means. The word perfect can also mean what it means when we say perfect tense. Perfect tense in English indicates action that's completed in the past with results that continue in the present. And in our analogy of jet lag, where we're brought into the new creation, we're brought into the kingdom of God, and we're not acclimated to it, and we get jet lag and we're disoriented by our old habits in our new context. Perfection just means full acclimation. It means that we're finally at home. Being acclimated doesn't just mean, hey, I'm a tourist who knows my way around. No, we're citizens of what Paul calls the commonwealth of Israel. And Israel had a purpose all along. And so being fully acclimated means we can do our jobs properly. We're no longer on probation and on the tenure track. We've arrived and we're ready for full responsibilities. Because there are tasks in the new creation. Isaiah 2 talks about Israel beating its swords and all the nations beating their swords into plowshares. Well, that means there's work to do. They don't beat them into little gold watches that you get at a retirement party. There are tasks. Paul in 1 Corinthians 6 says, Are you not to judge Will we not judge the angels? He envisions work for us. And that's why it's so important that we be ready for it. That's why the people whose lives are characterized by immorality and idolatry and adultery and perversion and theft and greed and drunkenness, etc., won't inherit the kingdom of God. Those folks don't get promotions. They're not ready for step 3. They're not ready for the tasks of the New Jerusalem. They're not ready for the tasks of the kingdom of God. You wouldn't want to come before a judge like that. Make sense? So I think step 3 helps us locate all the work that's happening in step 2, as well as the purpose in step 0 and 1. We're not just created to enjoy an awesome retirement. We're created for eternal usefulness. I made this point at a church a while ago, and one of the elderly people there smiled and said, "You mean I get to go back to work?" And it was like, yeah, you get to go back to work. He must have enjoyed his job, because he got a glimpse of a future that he'd like to return to in some way. Tom Wright describes Christian life now, step 2, as anticipating the resurrection, sort of leaning forward into the future that's been prepared for us. It's a nice way to describe the kinds of efforts that happen in step 2, that it's all oriented towards the future. If step 0 is about prevenient or prior grace, and step 1 is regeneration, which is associated with justification. And step 2 ends up described dominantly by sanctification, getting prepared to be worthy for the special use that God has for us. Step 3 is called glorification. In the Eastern Church, it's called theosis, divinization. This is also where the category of sainthood comes in. Christians, especially Catholics, Orthodox, and a few others, will use the word saints to refer to people who have run that race, who are presumably at step 3. Saints aren't gods. They're not, Protestants sometimes get allergic to the word saints because it seems like, a line's being crossed between us and God. Well, no, it's not. These are just people who have gone ahead of us, are cheering us on in that image in Hebrews where we're running the race and we're entering the stadium for that last lap, and all the people who have gone before us are cheering us on and seeing us to the end and doing what they can to support us. That's a charitable, but I think genuine interpretation of how saints are understood in Catholic and Orthodox and Anglican circles. That's the framework. Those are some ways of understanding step 3. Let's look at some of what the church does. Let's look at some step 3 practices. Well, I'm going to give you Eucharist, communion, Lord's Supper, whatever you choose to call it, as a step 3 practice. You could classify it elsewhere as well if you wanted to, but it looks back on Jesus' definitive self-gift for us, and it looks forward to when we eat and drink together with him. It's a profoundly hopeful practice. It signifies our hope. It anticipates the goal of our hope. Likewise, excommunication is a step 3 practice. Excommunication is a warning of the dire consequences of unreadiness. And finally, benediction, the last thing that happens in the service, where your leader just gives an unconditional blessing on the whole congregation. That's a step 3 practice, I think. If you listen to the kinds of things that are said in step 3, it's not like, well, I hope you're all right this week and you don't mess up. I hope we see you next week. I hope you survive the week. It's the one who promises these things is faithful, and he will do it. May God sanctify you wholly. I gave you medieval theology that speaks of the purgative way of step 0, where you set aside everything that's inappropriate for this new life in new time. and then which walks along the illuminative way of learning how to be oriented to the kingdom. And where does that end? Well, it's a threefold path for medieval theology, and the third one is called the unitive way, the way of union with God. Perfect eternal communion, and what the early church called the beatific vision, the sight of God and God's blessedness, the kind of face-to-face relationship that Paul describes in the future in 1 Corinthians 13. Now I see in part, then I will see in full. And I suppose a good place to close is just reminding you, all four steps, the framework in which fruit of the Spirit have their place. Creation is the object or the target of new being. That's step 0. God targets creation for new being. God grants righteousness in step 1 as what you might call the outward aspect of new being, the relational, immediate aspect of new being. Step 2 is where God grants holiness as the inward aspect of new being. Not necessarily in just the individual, but in the people themselves, right? In the community, in the fellowship. Don't individualize all of these steps. This is about the remaking of all creation, God's people, and finally individuals. And glory, step 3, you might call the goal or the proof of our new being. And what glory we have in the present is an anticipation and a confidence builder that that new being is arriving.